Prisons are meant to be places of punishment and reform, where wrongdoers serve their time and prepare to rejoin society. But what happens when the people entrusted to enforce order abuse their power in the most unimaginable ways? This is the story of a young woman, full of defiance and courage, who refused to give in to the demands of a man in uniform, a man whose authority she was supposed to trust. Her choice to say no to him wasn't just an act of bravery. It was an act that ultimately cost her life. How could this happen inside a facility with cameras, guards, and strict rules? How could a person sworn to uphold the law commit such a heinous act and think they could get away with it? What happened to this young woman will make you question everything you thought you knew about the justice system. And the chilling details of her final moments will stay with you long after this video ends. This isn't just a story about one officer's abuse of power. It's a story about a broken system that allowed a predator to roam free and prey on the vulnerable. Imagine being 18 years old, just stepping into adulthood with the world still ahead of you. But instead of having the freedom to explore your future, you find yourself locked behind bars. For Emily, that was the reality. An 18-year-old inmate, barely an adult, with so much left to experience in life, suddenly thrust into the harsh world of a Texas prison. She was trying to survive, trying to adapt to a life she never wanted, when the system she was supposed to rely on failed her in the most catastrophic way. Emily, like so many others, came to prison hoping for a chance to reflect, a chance to rebuild. But no one tells you about the hidden dangers behind prison walls, the dangers that lurk not in the shadows of other inmates, but in the very officers who are meant to protect you. One of those officers was Randall. To the outside world, he was just another guard, trusted to maintain order in the prison. He wore the uniform, held the authority, and commanded respect from his colleagues. But behind that uniform, Randall hid a disturbing side. It was a side that went unnoticed by most, yet it would set the stage for an unimaginable tragedy. You see, Randall didn't just want to control the inmates, he wanted to break them, use them, and manipulate them for his own desires. But what happens when a young woman refuses to give in, when she dares to stand up and say no? Emily's story is a stark reminder of just how vulnerable inmates can be, even in a system that's supposed to protect them. This case isn't just about one officer's twisted actions. It's about a broken system that allowed abuse to continue unchecked, a system where power can easily be used to exploit the vulnerable. So, why does this matter? Because this wasn't just an isolated incident. This case exposes the deep flaws in the prison system that allow people like Officer Randall to hide behind a badge while wreaking havoc on those who are already suffering. It shows how quickly power can corrupt and how easily the most vulnerable in our society are preyed upon. As we unfold this tragic story, we'll dive deeper into the horrifying events that led up to Emily's death. What went wrong? How did no one see the warning signs? And how did the system fail her in ways that no one could have imagined? The answers are not just chilling. They will make you question how far we've really come in ensuring justice for everyone. Welcome to True Crime Stories videos. I welcome you, my viewers, and most especially my subscribers, for your support as we keep improving and bringing you daily told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Before Emily ever stepped foot into the cold, unforgiving walls of a Texas prison, she was just a girl, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Emily grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone. Her childhood was far from perfect. Her family struggled to make ends meet, and life had a way of throwing obstacles in her path that most people her age could never imagine facing. She wasn't some hardened criminal. She wasn't someone who was destined to live a life behind bars. No, Emily was a girl who made mistakes. Like so many teenagers, she sometimes acted before thinking, sometimes made choices she would later regret. But she wasn't without hope. Emily loved art. She would spend hours sketching scenes from her imagination, places she dreamed of visiting one day. She wanted to see the world, to escape the small town where she often felt trapped. She talked about going to college, maybe even becoming an art teacher. Her family remembers how her eyes would light up when she talked about her dreams, and how, despite the difficulties she faced, she never stopped believing in a better. But life wasn't easy for Emily. Her parents worked long hours just to keep food on the table, and the pressure of growing up in a household where money was always tight weighed heavily on her. She started hanging out with the wrong crowd, looking for an escape, looking for people who understood her pain. And in doing so, she made choices that would alter the course of her life forever. Her family tried to help her. They tried to pull her back from the edge, but sometimes, when you're young, you think you know better. Emily didn't want to listen. She thought she could handle it on her own. She got mixed up in things she shouldn't have. Small things at first, but they snowballed. One bad decision led to another, and before anyone knew it, Emily found herself in trouble with the law. Her arrest wasn't shocking to those who knew her struggles, but it was heartbreaking. Her family hoped it would be a wake-up call, a chance for her to turn her life around. And in a way, Emily saw it that way too. She told her mother during one of their last phone calls before her sentencing, "I know I messed up, but this doesn't define me. I'll make it right, Mom. I promise." When she walked into that courtroom for the last time, Emily wasn't thinking about how her life had unraveled. She was thinking about how she could piece it back together. She was ready to serve her time, to pay for her mistakes, and to come out stronger. But how do you rebuild your life when the very system that's supposed to reform you becomes the source of your greatest fear? How do you hold on to hope when you're surrounded by people who see you as nothing more than a number, an inmate, a problem to manage? For Emily, the prison was supposed to be a place of reflection, a place where she could face her mistakes and plan for a brighter future. But it became a nightmare she could never wake up from. She was 18, just 18, when she walked into that facility. She had her whole life ahead of her, or at least she thought she did. Her story wasn't supposed to end here. She had dreams. She had a family who loved her. And now they're left with nothing but memories and questions. How did it come to this? How does a system designed to protect its inmates fail so completely? And what happened in those final moments that led to Emily's life being stolen from her? This isn't just about Emily. This is about every young person who's made a mistake, every family who's sent their loved one to a place they thought was safe, only to find out it wasn't. Emily's story didn't have to end this way, but it did. And now we're left to piece together the fragments of her life and the events that led to her tragic end. To the outside world, Officer Randall appeared to be the model of professionalism. A man in uniform, trusted with the authority to oversee inmates and maintain order. His colleagues described him as competent, reliable, the kind of officer who always followed protocol. But what do you really know about someone when all you see is the surface? Inside those prison walls, Randall had a reputation, one that wasn't talked about in official reports or staff meetings. Whispers circulated among inmates, murmurs about the way his eyes lingered too long, the way he seemed to single out certain individuals for extra attention. They were small things at first, moments that could easily be dismissed by those who weren't paying close attention. But for the inmates who lived under his watchful eye, those moments weren't so easily ignored. Emily had barely been in the facility for a few weeks when she first encountered Randall. At first, he seemed like any other officer, firm but polite, distant but not unfriendly. He addressed her by name, something not all officers bothered to do, and she thought little of it. After all, he was in charge, and she was just another inmate trying to get through her sentence. But then came the favors. It started small. Randall would let her stay out a little longer during recreation time or ensure she got an extra serving at meals. At first, Emily thought he was just being kind, perhaps even sympathetic to her situation. But kindness in a place like this always comes with a price, doesn't it? One day, he stopped her during her work shift in the laundry room. He stood too close, his voice low as he asked her about her family, her plans for the future. The questions were personal, invasive, but his tone was friendly, almost fatherly. Emily didn't know how to respond. She answered briefly, hoping he would move on, but instead he lingered. The other inmates began to notice. "Randall's got his eye on you," one of them warned her. "Be careful." Emily brushed it off, but deep down she felt it too, that unsettling feeling that he was watching her more than he should. Then the comments started. Compliments on her appearance, remarks about how she was different from the others, how she didn't belong in a place like this. It was flattering at first, but soon it became clear that Randall wasn't just being kind. He was testing her, pushing boundaries, seeing how far he could go. Emily tried to avoid him, but in a place like this, avoidance is nearly impossible. Randall was everywhere, during her shifts, in the cafeteria, even during head counts. And with every encounter, his behavior became more aggressive. He started making demands, asking her to meet him in private areas of the facility, places where cameras didn't reach. When she refused, his demeanor changed. The kindness vanished, replaced by cold, calculated anger. He began targeting her in other ways, assigning her to the most grueling tasks, writing her up for minor infractions, making her life inside those walls even harder than it already was. Emily confided in a fellow inmate, someone she trusted, but the response was disheartening. "That's just how it is here," they told her. "You do what he wants, or you suffer. That's the way it works." But Emily wasn't the kind of person to back down. She stood her ground, refusing to give in to Randall's demands. She reported him to another officer, but nothing came of it. The system wasn't built to protect her. It was built to protect men like him. And that's when things took a turn. Randall's behavior escalated. He became more erratic, more dangerous. Emily couldn't sleep at night, terrified of what he might do next. She tried to stay out of his way, but no matter where she went, he always seemed to find her. And then, one day, everything changed. What Randall did next wasn't just a violation of his role, his duty, or his oath. It was an act so egregious, so horrific, that it would shatter any illusion of safety within those prison walls. But here's the question. How does a man like Randall, with a history of predatory behavior, remain in a position of power? How many others had suffered in silence before Emily? And why did no one step in to stop him before it was too late? These are the questions that haunt this case. And as we piece together the events that led to Emily's tragic fate, the answers become more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. Prison is a place where power dictates survival. For those who hold the keys, power is absolute. But what happens when that power turns violent? What happens when authority becomes the very weapon meant to silence someone who dares to say no? Emily had tried to keep her distance from Randall. She avoided eye contact, kept her head down, and followed every rule to the letter. But her defiance, her refusal to comply with his demands, had turned her into a target. His once veiled threats were now spoken aloud. Quiet moments were filled with menacing whispers, always just low enough that no one else could hear. "You think you can ignore me? You'll regret this," he told her one day in the hallway, his words as sharp as the glare in his eyes. Emily confided in a prison counselor, begging for help. She described the way Randall would follow her during her work shifts, how he managed to appear at every corner she turned, how he made her feel like there was no escape. The counselor listened, nodded, but in the end, nothing changed. The system had failed her yet again, leaving her to fend for herself in a place where every move she made was watched. And then came the day that would change everything. It started like any other. The blaring sound of the morning alarm, the metallic clink of cell doors opening, the shuffle of inmates heading to their assigned duties. Emily had been assigned to clean one of the lesser-used areas of the facility, a place where the cameras didn't work as well, where the officers rarely patrolled. Randall was waiting for her there. He hadn't been assigned to that area, but he was there nonetheless. He blocked the only exit, his frame filling the doorway as he ordered her to put down her supplies. Emily's heart raced. She knew this wasn't just another warning, not another veiled threat. This was different. What do you do when there's no one to call for help? When the person standing in front of you controls every aspect of your life? Emily begged him to leave her alone, her voice shaking as she tried to reason with him. But Randall wasn't listening. His demands were clear, and when she refused yet again, his anger erupted. The other inmates heard muffled screams, but assumed it was just another confrontation, the kind that happened daily within these walls. But this wasn't just another confrontation. By the time the noise stopped, Emily was gone. It wasn't until hours later that staff found her body. She was in the same area she had been assigned to clean, her lifeless form slumped against the cold, unforgiving wall. Her injuries spoke volumes about the violence she had endured, the sheer brutality of what had happened to her. At first, the prison staff tried to downplay the incident. They labelled it as a tragic accident, hoping to avoid the scrutiny of an official investigation. But Emily's fellow inmates weren't about to let her story end like that. They spoke out, describing the weeks of harassment she had endured, the threats, the fear she lived with every day. And then, investigators uncovered something they never expected: Randall's personal history. Complaints had been filed against him before. Other inmates had reported similar behavior, but their voices had been silenced, their allegations swept under the rug. Now, there was no sweeping this under the rug. Emily's death was the breaking point, the moment that would force the prison system to confront its own failures. But here's the question that lingers. How many more stories like Emily's have gone untold? How many other lives have been lost because those in power refused to listen? Investigations are supposed to bring answers, but what happens when those answers point directly at someone within the system? Someone trusted with the safety and lives of the vulnerable? When Emily's body was found, the initial reaction was carefully controlled chaos. Officials moved quickly, calling it a tragic accident, trying to suppress the details before they ever left the prison walls. But there were cracks in their story, cracks big enough to let the truth escape. Investigators arrived with questions. Why was she alone in that isolated part of the prison? Why had no alarms been triggered? And why was Randall, an officer who wasn't assigned to that area, logged into a section of the prison he had no reason to be in? These questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered, until one brave inmate decided to speak up. She was one of Emily's closest friends in the facility. Through tears, she recounted weeks of harassment, how Randall had followed Emily, cornered her during work shifts, and made his vile intentions known. But most chilling of all, she shared something Emily had told her just days before she died. If anything happens to me, it's because of him. Please, don't let them cover it up. The investigators couldn't ignore this. They turned their focus to Randall, a man who had always carried himself with authority, with control. But beneath the surface, there were whispers, complaints from other inmates that had been quietly filed away, ignored, dismissed. It wasn't long before physical evidence began to emerge. Surveillance footage revealed Randall entering the same corridor where Emily's body was discovered, just minutes before her death. The footage didn't show what happened next, but it placed him at the scene, a damning piece of evidence that was hard to explain away. Then came the DNA results. Samples taken from Emily's clothing, and the scene matched Randall's profile, tying him directly to the crime. And yet, Even with this mounting evidence, the investigation faced roadblocks. Prison staff were reluctant to talk. There were rumors of intimidation, of officers being warned to keep quiet if they valued their careers. One officer admitted off the record that the prison had a long history of protecting its own, of sweeping misconduct under the rug to avoid scrutiny. "It's easier to pretend it didn't happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Emily's family refused to let their daughter's death be another statistic, another buried story. Her mother, her voice trembling with grief and anger, spoke at every press conference she could organize. "My daughter was supposed to be safe there," she said, clutching a framed photo of Emily. "She was paying for her mistakes, but who's paying for this? Who's holding them accountable for what they did to her?" The investigators pressed on, piecing together a timeline that left no room for doubt. They interviewed more inmates, each story adding to the chilling pattern of Randall's predatory behavior. Some described how he would target those who had no family to fight for them, how he seemed to know which complaints would be ignored. But Emily had fought back, and that, they believed, was why she became his target. Even with the evidence piling up, there were moments where the investigation felt like it was teetering on the edge. Randall denied everything, his demeanor calm, almost smug, as he sat across from detectives. "You think I'd risk everything for an inmate?" he asked, his voice cold and calculated. It was a performance meant to cast doubt, to plant the seed that maybe, just maybe, he was being framed. But what he didn't account for was the resilience of those determined to uncover the truth. Every lie he told unraveled under scrutiny. His alibi fell apart. Witnesses began to come forward, bolstered by the growing media attention on the case. And then there was the letter. Hidden in the pages of a library book, investigators found a note Emily had written weeks before her death. It was addressed to her mother. "I'm scared," it read. "He won't stop, no matter what I do. If something happens, please don't let them forget me." The letter was the final piece of the puzzle, a haunting reminder of the fear Emily had lived with in her final days. It broke the case wide open, leaving no room for doubt about what had happened and who was responsible. But as the investigation wrapped up, new questions began to emerge. How many more Emilys had suffered in silence? How many other officers like Randall were hiding behind their uniforms, their crimes buried by a system designed to protect its own? And most importantly, how could anyone ensure that this would never happen again? The case had exposed more than just a murderer. It had exposed a broken system, one that allowed predators to thrive while silencing their victims. And now the world was watching, demanding answers, demanding change. So, I'll ask you, what would you do if the person meant to protect your loved one turned out to be the threat? How do we fix a system that punishes the powerless and protects the powerful? Because until we answer those questions, can we really say justice has been served? When the trial began, it wasn't just a courtroom. It was a stage for the fight between truth and denial, justice and power. People came from all corners, some driven by a deep need to see accountability, others perhaps out of morbid curiosity. Journalists lined the back rows, pens poised, cameras waiting for every shift in expression. And at the center of it all sat Randall, a man who once wore a badge and carried authority, but now faced the harsh glare of judgment. From the moment the prosecution began, it was clear this would be no ordinary trial. The evidence was meticulous, damning, and presented with an unflinching precision that left the room silent. Surveillance footage showed Randall's movements that night, movements he couldn't explain. DNA evidence linked him to Emily in a way that no amount of deflection could undo. But the most gut-wrenching moments weren't in the technicalities of forensics or the cold facts of timestamps and entries. They came from the people who knew Emily. Her mother, trembling but resolute, took the stand and spoke about her daughter with a love so palpable it brought tears to more than a few in the gallery. "Emily was only 18, she said, her voice breaking. "She made mistakes like any teenager, but she didn't deserve this. No one does." The courtroom hung on her every word as she recounted the dreams her daughter once shared. A life that, while momentarily derailed, was meant for more than to end in a lifeless cell. She deserved a chance to come home, her mother said, her hands gripping the witness stand. But that chance was stolen. Then came the testimony of the inmates, women whose voices are so often silenced. One by one, they painted a portrait of a man who wielded power like a weapon. Their words were raw, unfiltered, and difficult to hear. One inmate, visibly shaken, spoke about how Randall had tried to manipulate and intimidate anyone who stood in his way. She described how Emily had confided in her, how she had feared what might happen but refused to give in. "Emily was brave," she said, wiping tears from her face. "She stood up to him when no one else could, but she paid the price for it." The defense tried its best to dismantle the prosecution's case. They questioned the credibility of the inmates, implying they had motives to lie. They called character witnesses for Randall, people who described him as a professional, a man who had dedicated years to the system. But none of it seemed to stick. Every attempt to muddy the waters only highlighted how damning the evidence truly was. And then came the medical examiner's testimony, a clinical breakdown of the injuries Emily had sustained. The words were technical, but the weight of them was unbearable. This wasn't just a case of violence, it was an act of brutality. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the examiner detailed the trauma Emily endured in her final moments, painting a picture that no one could unsee. As the trial reached its climax, the tension in the room was palpable. The jury's decision felt like an eternity in the making. When they returned, the foreperson's voice cut through the air with finality. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing was swift and unrelenting. The judge, his voice steady but laced with a rare intensity, addressed Randall directly. "You held a position of power, a responsibility to protect those in your care. Instead, you chose to abuse that power in the most heinous way imaginable. This court finds your actions to be not only criminal, but a profound betrayal of trust. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." For Emily's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring her back. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, some holding candles, others holding signs demanding systemic change. The air was charged with a mix of relief and anger. Reporters captured every moment as Emily's mother stepped up to a podium, her voice cracking but unwavering. "This isn't just about my daughter," she said. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through what she did. It's about changing a system that failed her." The case dominated headlines for weeks, sparking debates about prison reform, abuse of power, and the treatment of inmates. Advocacy groups seized the moment to push for new legislation, while social media erupted with calls for accountability at every level. But even as the dust began to settle, one question remained. How many more stories like Emily's are out there, hidden behind walls designed to keep the world out? How many voices are still waiting to be heard? So now, I ask you, what would you do to ensure that justice doesn't end here? How do we hold people accountable when they betray the trust we place in them? And how do we, as a society, protect the vulnerable from those who are supposed to protect them? Because this isn't just a story about one young woman. It's a story about all of us, about what we're willing to tolerate, and about what we're willing to fight for. What's your answer? As the gavel fell for the final time and the courtroom emptied, the echoes of Emily's story didn't fade. They stayed with the people who had witnessed the trial, with those who had read about it, and with anyone who had dared to ask the difficult questions this case demanded. How did this happen? And more importantly, how do we stop it from happening again? This wasn't just the story of one young woman lost too soon. It was the story of a system, one designed to correct, rehabilitate, and protect, but which instead allowed harm to fester in its shadows. And when the dust settles, when the headlines move on to the next story, the question remains, will anything truly change? Emily wasn't born into a life of crime. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who had dreams and aspirations despite the mistakes she had made. She wanted another chance, a chance to rebuild her life. But she never got that chance, did she? Instead, she was failed by those tasked with her care, by those entrusted to uphold the law. And Randall, the man who wore a badge of authority, became the embodiment of everything wrong within that system. His actions were monstrous, yes, but what about those who looked the other way? The colleagues who stayed silent? The administration that didn't act on warnings? Isn't their complicity just as damning? But let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what does justice truly mean in a case like this? Randall was convicted, sentenced to life behind bars. But does that bring Emily back? Does it undo the pain her family endures every single day? And does it fix a system that allowed this to happen in the first place? These are the hard truths we have to face. Emily's case isn't unique. It's just one of countless stories that never see the light of day. Women and men trapped in a system that dehumanizes them, strips them of their dignity, and leaves them vulnerable to predators who use their positions of power to exploit rather than protect. You've heard the evidence. You've heard Emily's mother's pleas, the voices of inmates who dared to speak out, and the testimony of those who refused to let her memory be erased. But now I'm asking you directly, where do we go from here? How do we turn this tragedy into a catalyst for change? Some might argue it's not their problem, that the people behind bars made their choices and they deserve what happens to them. But does anyone deserve to die in fear, abandoned by the very system meant to protect them? And if we allow this to continue, what does that say about us as a society? Prison reform isn't just about policies and oversight, it's about humanity. It's about recognizing that every person, no matter their mistakes, deserves safety, dignity, and a chance to rebuild. It's about holding those in power accountable, from the guards on the ground to the administrators at the top. So, what can you do? You, sitting there listening to this story, feeling the weight of Emily's life and death. You can make a difference. Advocate for change. Write to your representatives. Demand transparency in prisons, better training for correctional officers, and stronger protections for inmates. Join organizations fighting for reform. Speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. Because silence is what allowed this to happen. Silence is what gave Randall the space to operate unchecked. And silence is what continues to endanger the lives of those who are out of sight, out of mind. Emily's mother, in the wake of unimaginable loss, found her voice. She now speaks for her daughter and for every other victim whose voice was silenced. She's out there, fighting for change. But she can't do it alone. This case is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable in our society. But it's also a call to action, a challenge to each of us to look beyond the surface and question the systems we so often take for granted. So, I'll ask you again, what are we going to do about it? Will Emily's story fade into a statistic, or will it be the spark that ignites real, lasting reform? The fight for justice doesn't end here. It begins with you. The choice is yours. What do you think could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Was it a failure of oversight, of policy, or of humanity itself? I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about how we can stop this from happening again. And if you found this story as heartbreaking and important as I did, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the truths that need to be heard and spark the conversations that can lead to change. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.